There's a version of science that gets taught in school where everything more or less adds up. Atoms, gravity, DNA, the water cycle. It all fits together in this tidy little narrative where humans started confused, then got smart, then figured it out. The story has a shape. You learn it, you believe it, and then you move on with your life. But there's a different version of science, the one they don't really advertise, where the most fundamental questions about existence, consciousness, and reality just kind of sit there, unanswered, while scientists politely change the subject. And I don't mean niche stuff. I don't mean we haven't fully mapped every species of beetle. I mean the absolute bedrock questions, the kind where you'd think we'd have cracked them by now, the kind where if you ask a physicist or a neurologist or a biologist what the actual answer is, they'll give you a very confident-sounding answer that, if you follow it all the way to the end, terminates in a shrug. We have sent a car to Mars. We have sequenced the human genome. We have detected gravitational waves from two black holes colliding a billion light-years away. Which, stop and think about that for a second. We felt the echo of something that happened a billion years ago in a galaxy we'll never visit. And yet, there are things happening right now, inside your own head, inside your own body, in the room you're sitting in, that science genuinely cannot explain. Not hasn't explained yet. Cannot, currently, explain. That distinction matters, and it's the thing this whole video is about. Let's start with the one that breaks me a little every time I think about it. You are conscious right now. You know you're watching this. There is something it feels like to be you, the low hum of whatever mood you're in, the specific texture of being a person sitting wherever you're sitting, the fact that there's an inside to your experience. Scientists call this phenomenal consciousness, and philosophers call it qualia, and everyone calls it the thing that makes life feel like anything at all, rather than just a series of mechanical events happening in the dark. Here's the problem. Nobody knows why it exists. Not in a hand-wavy way. In a very specific, deeply uncomfortable way that philosophers have been screaming about for decades, and that neuroscientists are increasingly being forced to take seriously. It's called the hard problem of consciousness, and it was named by a philosopher named David Chalmers in 1995, which, considering how old philosophy is embarrassingly recent for someone to go, wait, has anyone actually thought about this? Here's the gap. We can describe what happens in the brain when you see the color red. The light hits your retina, your optic nerve fires, specific regions of your visual cortex activate, you reach out and grab the tomato. All of that is measurable. All of that is explainable in terms of neurons talking to each other with electrochemical signals. What we cannot explain is why any of that feels like anything. Why does the electrochemical signal produce an inner experience of redness? Why isn't it just information processing? Input, computation, output, with no one home to experience it? Why is there a you in there at all? Why isn't your brain just running the software with the lights off? Some scientists argue that consciousness is an emergent property of complex information processing, that once a system gets complicated enough, experience just sort of shows up, which sounds compelling until you ask the obvious follow-up question, which is why, and then they sort of look at their shoes. Some philosophers take it further and say that maybe the question is unanswerable by definition, that consciousness can't explain itself because any explanation would itself be a conscious experience, and you're back at square one, which is the philosophical equivalent of trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. And some people, serious people, researchers with tenure, have started arguing for panpsychism, which is the idea that consciousness isn't produced by brains, it's a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or charge, and that even basic matter has some primitive form of inner experience. Which, yes, does sound like something someone says right before they try to sell you crystals, but which is being published in peer-reviewed philosophy and physics journals with increasing frequency, because the alternatives are running out. Nobody knows. That's the punchline. You have spent your entire life being conscious, and science has no idea what that is or why it's happening. Okay, let's talk about sleep. You do it every night. You've done it roughly 10,000 times, and the reasons why are still, this is going to sound insane, genuinely unclear. We know sleep is necessary. We know that if you deprive people of it long enough, bad things happen in a sequence that gets very bad very fast. Cognitive collapse, hallucinations, immune system failure. We know the body does important maintenance during sleep, that memory consolidation happens, that the glymphatic system, this recently discovered waste clearance system in the brain, runs a cleaning cycle during sleep that flushes out metabolic byproducts, including some associated with Alzheimer's. All of that's real. The mystery isn't whether sleep matters. The mystery is why it requires unconsciousness. Why does all of that maintenance have to happen while you're offline? Why can't the glymphatic system clean your brain while you're awake? Why can't memory consolidation happen during the commute? Evolution is not sentimental. It doesn't preserve costly behaviors without a reason, and sleep is genuinely costly. You're lying completely still for 8 hours, not finding food, not finding mates, not running from things that want to eat you. For the entirety of evolutionary history, being unconscious for a third of your life was a serious liability. So whatever sleep is doing, it must be doing something so important that the benefit outweighs the enormous risk of being unconscious in an environment full of predators. And we still haven't fully identified what that something is. There are theories, several good ones, but the field hasn't landed on a single unified explanation. And every time researchers think they've found it, they find another animal that does something that doesn't quite fit the theory, and they have to go back to the drawing board. You've spent roughly a third of your life doing something we don't fully understand. You've just never had to think about it, because it happens automatically, which is probably good, because if you had to consciously decide to fall asleep, you'd probably never manage it, and you'd be even more tired than you already are. Let's go bigger. Somewhere between 80 and 95% of the universe is invisible to us. Not invisible in the way your keys are invisible because you put them somewhere dumb. Invisible in the way that it emits no light, absorbs no light, reflects no light, and interacts with ordinary matter only through gravity. We call it dark matter and dark energy, and those names are the scientific equivalent of labeling a folder miscellaneous because you don't know what to do with it. Dark matter we at least have decent evidence for. Galaxies spin in ways that make no sense given the amount of visible matter in them. The outer arms of spiral galaxies move too fast, way too fast, as if there's a whole lot more mass out there than we can see pulling on everything. When we look at galaxy clusters, the gravitational lensing, the way light bends around massive objects, implies far more mass than the visible stuff accounts for. Something is there. Something has gravity. We just cannot detect it directly. We don't know what it's made of, and every experiment designed to find it has come up empty. Dark energy is even weirder. In 1998, astronomers discovered that the universe isn't just expanding, it's accelerating. Space is stretching faster and faster over time, and the force responsible for this has been named dark energy, which is not really a name so much as a placeholder for, we have no idea what this is, but we needed to call it something. It makes up about 68% of everything. It is the dominant feature of the universe, and we know essentially nothing about it. This is the part where I want you to actually sit with the numbers. Less than 5% of the universe is the stuff you learned about in chemistry class. The atoms, the protons and neutrons and electrons, the periodic table. Everything you've ever seen, touched, eaten, or visited. The stars, the planets, the oceans, every human being who has ever lived. That's the 5%. The other 95% is dark matter and dark energy, and we have no confirmed idea what either of them actually is. Cosmologists are not panicking about this, which I find genuinely impressive. They've just sort of incorporated it into the models and kept going, which is the intellectual equivalent of doing a home renovation, knocking a hole in the wall, discovering a whole room you didn't know existed, and going, huh, interesting, and then going back to retiling the bathroom. Here's one that's closer to home. More personal, almost annoyingly so. How do anesthetics work? You have almost certainly been under general anesthesia, or you know someone who has, and the procedure is so normalized at this point that it doesn't seem strange. You count backwards from 10. You get to 7. Then you're in recovery with a scratchy blanket and someone is handing you a juice box. What happened in between is, medically speaking, a mystery. Not in every detail. We know the drugs bind to certain receptors. We can observe the brain entering specific states. We can monitor what's happening electrically. But the mechanism by which anesthetic agents actually produce unconsciousness is not understood. The specific way they interrupt experience, the why of it, not just the what, remains genuinely unknown. Different anesthetic agents have wildly different chemical structures and yet produce the same effect, which is deeply weird and suggests we don't have the underlying explanation right. If we did, we'd be able to predict what produces unconsciousness and what doesn't, but we can't. Not reliably, from first principles. This loops back to the consciousness problem. We can knock it out. We just don't know what we're knocking out, or precisely how. There's something quietly wild about the fact that surgery, one of the most routine, life-saving, technically sophisticated things modern medicine does, rests on a foundation of, we don't totally know how this part works, but it works, so You would not feel great about your mechanics saying this, and yet, here we are. Okay, one more. Your gut has a nervous system. You probably sort of knew this. You've heard gut feeling has a literal basis. You've heard the gut called the second brain. But the full picture is more interesting and more unresolved than the pop science version. The enteric nervous system, the network of neurons lining your gastrointestinal tract, contains somewhere between 100 and 500 million neurons. That's more neurons than the spinal cord. It can operate largely independently of the brain. It has its own sensory neurons, its own motor neurons, its own interneurons. It does not need the brain to direct traffic. It runs. The gut also contains the vast majority of the body's serotonin, somewhere around 90%, depending on who's counting. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with mood, mental health, the entire serotonin-based antidepressant industry. Mostly in your gut, mostly doing things that aren't directly related to your mood, regulating intestinal movement mostly, but still. And then there's the microbiome, which is a whole additional layer of weird. The trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms living in your digestive system that we now have evidence can influence mood, cognition, stress response, immune function, and possibly behavior in ways that are still being mapped. Mouse studies, which, yes, mice are not people, this is a real limitation, have shown that transplanting gut bacteria from anxious mice into calm mice produces anxious behavior in the formerly calm mice. That you can alter personality through the gut. We are at the beginning of understanding this, not the end. The gut-brain axis is a real thing that influences your mental and physical health in ways that medicine is only starting to take seriously, after decades of treating mental health and digestive health as entirely separate systems. And the mechanisms, how the gut talks to the brain, what the microbiome is actually doing up there in the prefrontal cortex, are largely unknown. Which means every person who was told their anxiety was just in their head might have had some very relevant activity in their intestines that nobody was paying attention to. I want to tie these together because they're not random. There's a pattern: consciousness, sleep, dark energy, anesthesia, the gut-brain axis. On the surface, these look like they're from completely different departments: neuroscience, cosmology, medicine, microbiology, but they all bump into the same wall. They're all cases where the deeper you go, the more you realize the tools we have for explaining things hit a floor, and below that floor is something we don't have the language for yet. The way science mostly works is you observe a phenomenon, you generate a hypothesis, you test it, you refine it, you eventually land on an explanation that lets you make accurate predictions. And for most things, this works beautifully. Pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, structural engineering, vaccines. The entire built environment of the modern world is basically applied science working correctly. But there's a class of questions where the phenomenon is undeniable and the explanations keep stalling. Not because the scientists aren't smart. They are. They're extremely smart. But because the phenomenon might require a different kind of explanation than the ones we currently have. We might need new concepts. Not new data fed into old frameworks, but entirely new frameworks for thinking about what's happening. That happened before. It's happened several times. Newtonian mechanics was not wrong. It was incomplete, and the incompleteness only became visible when you got to speeds and scales where Newtonian mechanics predicted the wrong thing. Then Einstein happened, and quantum mechanics happened, and those frameworks didn't so much disprove classical physics as reveal that it was operating at a level of abstraction that worked fine until it didn't. At the edges, it broke. The questions that stump us right now, consciousness especially, but also the others, might be the edges. The places where current frameworks predict the wrong thing or predict nothing at all. And the new framework, whatever it looks like, hasn't been invented yet. It might be being invented right now by someone sitting in a graduate seminar somewhere, finding the current explanations unsatisfying in a way they can't yet articulate. Or it might be 100 years away. Here's the thing nobody says clearly enough. The unanswered questions are not a failure of science. They're the proof that science is real. A system that's just a story we told ourselves to feel better would have tidy answers to everything. The fact that it doesn't, the fact that the more seriously you take the method, the more honestly you have to confront what it can't yet reach, is precisely what makes it trustworthy when it does work. The version of science that has it all figured out is the fake one. The real one sits with the gaps, which means you now know something most people don't. Not because the information was hidden, It's all out there. But because the comfortable version, the we basically understand everything important version, is so much easier to live with that most people just quietly adopt it and move on. You're conscious right now, for reasons nobody can fully explain, reading or hearing words whose meaning your brain processes in ways that remain partly mysterious, digesting something with a second nervous system that's quietly influencing your mood, in a universe that's 95% invisible stuff. And you'll go to sleep tonight through a mechanism that evolution found essential enough to make mandatory, despite it making you vulnerable for 8 hours. None of that is frightening. It's just true. And there's something weirdly freeing about it. Knowing that the most fundamental features of your experience are still open questions. It means the story isn't finished. It means the people who will eventually figure this out haven't been born yet, or they're in high school right now, failing a test about something they find irrelevant. Science didn't fail to explain consciousness and dark matter and sleep and the rest of it. It just hasn't yet. And the gap between those two things, hasn't and can't, is where everything interesting lives.